In 1942, an entire generation of young women vanished from the Korean countryside. They didn't die in battle. They weren't listed among the missing soldiers. They simply disappeared, taken in the dead of night by an empire that believed silence was obedience. For decades, the world would not speak their names. But history remembers them by another title: the Comfort Women. The story begins in a small fishing village on Korea's southern coast, a place untouched by war until the sound of engines came rolling across the hills. Old photographs from that region show life before the silence. Wooden houses by the sea, girls carrying baskets of rice, laughter echoing through the narrow dirt roads. No one in those photographs could have imagined what was coming. The Japanese occupation had already tightened its grip. Curfews, inspections, young men conscripted for labor. But what came next targeted those who had no way to fight back: the daughters. The first trucks appeared at dawn. Witnesses say they flew the flag of the rising sun. Soldiers went door to door, carrying ledgers and lists written in Japanese. They asked for names, ages, and families. In one home, a mother lied. She said her daughter was married, hoping it would spare her. In another, a father hid his child beneath the floorboards, his hand trembling as boots passed overhead. But the soldiers weren't looking for excuses. They were following orders. Those who resisted were beaten. Those who begged were ignored. And by the time the trucks left, the village had grown silent, a silence that would last for generations. Historical records from local archives mention the same pattern across dozens of villages: rural, poor, isolated. The soldiers called it mobilization. The families called it disappearance. There were no official announcements, no newspapers, no funerals, only rumors, whispers that the girls were being sent to work for the army. No one dared to ask what that meant. Among the missing was a 16-year-old girl named Soo Jin, the daughter of a fisherman. Her name appears once in a confiscated village registry, then disappears completely from all later documents. No record of death, no burial site, only absence. Neighbors later claimed they remembered her. Quiet, curious, often seen writing small poems in a notebook. Her mother had given her that notebook on her birthday, telling her to write down the things you never want to forget. It would become the last trace of her life before the war erased her. For years, no one dared speak about what happened. Families were told to forget, to move on, to rebuild. But forgetting is not the same as healing, and silence can last only so long before it starts to scream. In the 1980s, historians began uncovering fragments, broken ledgers, military memos, and testimonies from the few who survived. They painted a picture too horrifying to ignore. The missing girls had not vanished into the earth. They had been transported across borders to military outposts, garrisons, and camps where their identities were stripped away. The documents described them only as comfort providers. No names, no families, just numbers. But behind every number was a daughter, a sister, a child, a memory buried beneath official lies. The empire called it necessity. The victims called it hell. One testimony, recorded decades later, describes the night Soo Jin's village fell silent. An elderly witness recalled, "They came when the dogs stopped barking. We thought it was thunder, but it was trucks. They took the girls first. Then they took the names." When asked how many were taken, the witness paused before answering. Enough that the morning felt empty. Enough that no one sang again. The village of Hwasun no longer exists as it did. The fields are gone, replaced by highways and factories. But locals say that when the wind moves across the coast at night, it carries faint echoes, women's voices, calling names that history forgot. Archaeologists later found fragments of charred notebooks near the site of an old military storage building. One page survived the fire. It read, in faint pencil marks, "If someone finds this, Tell my mother I am still dreaming. The handwriting matched the style taught in Hwasun's only school in the 1930s, the school where Su Jin once studied. Today, the story of the comfort women stands as one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. A system built on silence, sustained by fear, and exposed only by the courage of those who survived it. The empire that took them tried to erase their existence. But history does not forget. It waits. It watches. And when the silence breaks, the truth returns. Piece by piece. Name by name. They called it a rest house, but the doors had no handles from the inside. By dawn, the trucks arrived at a coastal outpost in occupied territory. The sea outside was gray, motionless, the kind of silence that swallows screams before they leave the throat. The girls were herded off the trucks. Their names still clung to them like ghosts. By nightfall, even those would be taken away. The soldiers didn't look at them as people. They looked at them as inventory. One officer, clipboard in hand, marked each arrival with a number. No one spoke. Every sound, boots crunching gravel, metal clinking, paper rustling, echoed like thunder in a dead church. Su Jin stood in line. She was only 16. Behind her, a girl whispered a prayer under her breath, not in fear, but disbelief that prayers still existed. The air smelled of diesel and salt. The sea watched, indifferent. Inside, the rooms were small, narrow. A table, a bucket, a single window covered by wire. The walls were painted white once, but now they were gray with fingerprints and shadow. The soldiers called it a comfort station. The girls called it the House of Silence. When the war ended, no one told the girls. There were no announcements, no parades, no flags waving in liberation. Just a single morning when the guards didn't return. The gates stood open, creaking in the wind. The sea outside was restless, as if whispering, "Run." Su Jin stepped out barefoot. The ground was soft with ash. The buildings around her were half burned. The empire's trophies reduced to ruin. A few girls followed behind her, their eyes hollow but shining with something dangerous. Hope. For the first time in years, there was no sound of boots, no shouts, only silence and the slow, uncertain heartbeat of freedom. They walked for miles. No one knew where they were going. The roads were lined with wreckage, helmets, torn flags, letters never delivered. A dead radio played static in a trench, like a ghost refusing to die. At night, they built fires. They didn't talk much. Words felt too small for what they carried. Su Jin watched the flames and wondered if her name still belonged to her. When they finally reached the nearest village, the people stared. The war had eaten everything, crops, homes, sons, and now it returned the daughters, broken and unrecognizable. "Who are you?" an old woman asked. Su Jin tried to answer, but her voice cracked. She said her name once, then again, as if repeating it could make it real. No one came forward. No arms opened. Some whispered that the girls were cursed. Others said they must have served willingly. Rumors traveled faster than truth ever could. So the girls stayed on the outskirts, sleeping in abandoned barns and half-fallen houses. They washed in rivers and cooked what little they could find. When they looked in mirrors, they didn't see survivors. They saw witnesses to something no one wanted to remember. One night, a soldier, young, wearing a different uniform now, stopped by their fire. He said the empire was gone. He said peace had returned. Su Jin looked at him, her eyes dull in the firelight. "Peace?" she whispered. "Where?" The man had no answer. He just looked away, ashamed of a war he hadn't fought. Years passed. Some girls changed their names and vanished into cities. Others never spoke again. A few began to tell their stories, not for pity, but for justice. But when they did, people looked away. They called them liars. They called them disgraceful. Su Jin began writing her memories on scraps of paper. fragments of a truth no one wanted to read. She buried them in jars beneath an old tree by the sea, so that one day, she wrote, when the world pretends this never happened, the earth will still remember. The House of Silence was gone, but its echo lived in every nightmare, every unspoken word. It was not the kind of story history liked to tell. Decades later, when reporters and historians came searching for witnesses, Su Jin was an old woman. Her hands trembled, her voice quivered like a candle in the wind. "They told us to forget," she said. "But forgetting is a luxury the dead never gave us." She closed her eyes, and the room fell quiet, as if the ghosts had gathered, listening. Outside, waves crashed against the same coast where it all began. Fishermen still spoke of the nights when the sea hummed softly, not like a storm, but like a memory refusing to drown. Because the truth does not vanish when the war ends. It waits, in silence, for someone brave enough to listen. By the 1960s, the world had rebuilt its cities, but not its conscience. Concrete covered ruins. New flags replaced the old. The war was now a story told in textbooks, edited, polished, and stripped of its screams. And yet, somewhere beneath the surface, something still stirred. In a small apartment on the edge of Seoul, Su Jin lived alone. Her walls were covered with newspaper clippings, names of generals, treaties, photos of men shaking hands. Beneath one article, she had written 3 words in faded ink. "We remember still." Every morning she watched the sun rise through her window and wondered how the same light could shine on both truth and lies. Neighbors called her the quiet widow. They didn't know her story. They didn't ask. The past was a shadow no one wanted to step into. But silence, when stretched too long, begins to crack. One winter morning, Su Jin saw a headline. A historian in Japan had denied that comfort women ever existed. He called it propaganda. He said there was no proof. Her hands trembled. The paper fell to the floor. No proof. She opened the drawer beside her bed. Inside were the same glass jars she once buried by the sea, now filled with crumpled pages, ink faded by time. Each one a memory, each one a name. That night, she didn't sleep. She lit a single candle and began rewriting everything she could remember. Every road, every face, every sound that history had erased. She wasn't alone. Across the country, other women, forgotten survivors scattered across villages and cities, began to speak. Some gathered in temples, others in community halls. Many could barely walk, but their voices carried further than armies ever could. They called themselves halmoni, grandmothers. Not victims. Witnesses, reporters came. Cameras followed. For the first time, the world began to listen. Awkwardly, skeptically. But they listened. In one interview, Su Jin's voice cracked halfway through her sentence. The reporter leaned closer, asking if she wanted to stop. She shook her head. "No," she said. "They wanted us silent. That's why I have to speak." Her words echoed like thunder, not in volume, but in truth. Protests began to rise outside embassies. Old women holding signs with trembling hands, standing in the rain, week after week, year after year. Their umbrellas faded, their feet swollen, but their eyes burned with something unbreakable. The world called them the Wednesday Women. The governments called them a political inconvenience. But history began to call them proof. One day, a young student visited Su Jin. She had read her story online. She asked, "How did you survive?" Su Jin smiled faintly, looking out the window. "I didn't," she said. But the truth did. The girl didn't understand at first. But she recorded every word, every pause, every flicker of that candle in the old woman's eyes. Years later, those recordings would become evidence, played in courtrooms, broadcast on screens, forcing nations to face the ghosts they had buried under concrete and denial. Still, not everyone believed. Some said the women exaggerated. Others said the war was too long ago to matter. Soo Jin would listen to those voices on the radio, her expression unreadable. Then she'd whisper softly, "If pain has an expiration date, tell that to the dead." In her final days, she returned to the sea. The same gray waves, the same silence. Only now, a small stone monument stood there, carved with a single word, "Remember." She placed her hand on the cold surface, eyes closed. The wind carried a faint sound, humming, like the song from the House of Silence long ago. It was not sorrow anymore. It was defiance. By the late 1980s, the world was changing, faster than truth could keep up. Newspapers spoke of progress, of democracy, of peace. But in the corners of those headlines, the past still whispered. The first monument was small, a stone figure of a young girl sitting on a bench, staring straight ahead. No weapons, no anger, just silence. They placed it in front of an embassy, under the open sky. The next morning, officials called it provocation. Diplomats demanded it be removed. But the women refused. They sat beside the statue, holding hands, their shadows merging with hers. Television cameras arrived. For the first time, millions saw the faces that history had tried to hide. Wrinkled, aged, but alive. The Halmoni looked straight into the lens and spoke. "We are not ghosts," they said. "We were children." The world listened and flinched, because their stories didn't belong to one country or one army. They belonged to every place where war had turned girls into silence. In Japan, classrooms skipped those chapters. In Korea, some politicians warned not to reopen old wounds. In the West, history books used careful words. Comfort stations, military service women, wartime companions, euphemisms, polished until they erased the crime. But truth has a way of surviving censorship. It leaks through cracks. It waits in archives. It breathes through survivors. By the 1990s, photographs began to surface. Faded, grainy, undeniable. Journalists traced the old military routes. Archaeologists dug up what governments had buried. Each discovery added a new layer of proof, a new voice to the silence. Yet, every revelation met resistance. Some called it anti-national. Others claimed lack of documentation, as if a war crime needs paperwork to be real. In one hearing, a survivor stood before a committee of men in suits. Cameras flashed, microphones buzzed. She spoke slowly, her voice shaking but unwavering. "You wrote our names in ledgers," she said. "You marked our bodies with numbers. And now you ask for proof?" The room fell silent. That footage went viral decades later, reigniting outrage across generations. University students marched in Tokyo, Seoul, Manila, Jakarta, carrying banners that read, "They were not comfort, they were captive." In the crowd, a young girl carried Soo Jin's picture, printed from an online archive, faded at the edges. She didn't know who took the photo. She didn't know if Soo Jin ever smiled again. But she walked for her anyway, because sometimes memory needs strangers to keep it alive. By the 2000s, the battle wasn't just historical. It was political, ideological, cultural. Apologies were issued, then retracted. Payments were offered, then withdrawn. Words like regret and sorrow replaced responsibility. The survivors were now in their 80s, their bodies frail, but their conviction sharp as glass. Every Wednesday, they still gathered, sitting before the same embassy where the statue remained, unmoved, staring straight ahead. Winter, summer, rain, or heat, they came. Some carried oxygen tanks, others came in wheelchairs. But they came because the war was over. The silence was not, and as nations debated numbers and treaties, the truth sat quietly on that bronze bench, the statue of a girl whose gaze accused history itself. Su Jin's writings, found after her death, were published by activists. The book became a testimony used in courts and classrooms. On the first page she had written, "If you cannot face our pain, at least remember our names. We are what your history forgot to mourn." That sentence was carved into the base of a new memorial. Not in Seoul, not in Tokyo, but in Washington, D.C., because the ghosts had crossed oceans, and on the day it was unveiled, an old woman, one of the last living survivors, touched the stone and whispered, "We're home now." The cameras zoomed in, the crowd applauded, and somewhere beyond the noise, the sea roared again, eternal, indifferent, carrying the echoes of those who never made it back. History had written its records, but memory was still fighting to be heard. The last of the Halmoni were fading. Hospitals replaced their homes. Candles replaced their voices. But every week, without fail, young faces filled the space they left. Behind, students, artists, historians, teenagers, holding placards painted in red and black, colors of both blood and ink. They stood outside the same embassy where Su Jin's generation had once protested. The bronze statue of the girl still sat there, untouched, her empty chair beside her, waiting for anyone brave enough to take the seat. And every Wednesday, someone did. Sometimes it was a child, sometimes a poet, sometimes a survivor's granddaughter, reading from an old diary with trembling hands. The world had changed, but denial hadn't. Textbooks still softened the truth. Governments still issued statements filled with words like misunderstanding and regret. History once again tried to fade into diplomacy. But the children of silence were not diplomats. They were storytellers. In university film clubs, they reenacted the old testimonies through art. In classrooms, they built projects titled The Forgotten Voices. In digital archives, they uploaded scanned letters, photographs, and interviews. Hashtags replaced whispers. Social media threads carried stories across oceans faster than ships ever could. One post read, "My grandmother never spoke about the war. She just hummed when it rained. I found her name today on a list of survivors." It was shared 1,000,000 times. Documentaries followed. Films that didn't need monsters because history already had them. Shorts where the screen went black. At the moment, the truth became unbearable. Art galleries filled with portraits. Faceless women painted in gray, each with a small tag beneath. Unknown. Unforgotten. And still, outside the embassy, the protests continued. The chair beside the statue was never empty. One winter morning, a young woman named Hannah, a university student studying history, sat on that chair. She held a letter. It was yellowed, edges torn, words faded by time. It was Su Jin's. She began to read aloud. "We were told to forget. But silence is not peace. Silence is surrender." The crowd fell still. Cameras recorded. And across the world, people watched live, the same story retold by a new voice. That night, Hannah uploaded the clip online. Within hours, it spread through forums, classrooms, and news broadcasts. Some called it propaganda. Others called it courage, but millions called it truth. In the months that followed, more statues appeared. In Berlin, Manila, Sydney, New York, everyone the same. A young girl in bronze, seated beside an empty chair. Each city claimed it was a symbol of remembrance. Each government debated whether it was appropriate. History was once again under negotiation. But in Seoul, under the pale glow of streetlights, Hannah visited the old sea. The waves still sounded the same, slow, heavy, eternal. She knelt in the sand and pressed Sujin's letter into a bottle, sealing it tight. Then she threw it into the water. "Carry her," she whispered. "Carry all of them." The bottle drifted out into the dark, a single glimmer swallowed by the endless gray. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the sea began to hum again, the same low, trembling melody that once echoed from the House of Silence. This time, it wasn't sorrow. It was memory. It was resistance. It was the sound of silence learning how to speak. The war thundered closer. You could hear it. The metallic growl of tanks echoing in the distance, the sky bruised with smoke and fire. The guards grew restless. Orders were shouted, papers burned, and the stench of gasoline clung to everything. Something was ending. But for Hannah and the others, it felt like the end of the world itself. Inside the barracks, the women huddled together, listening to the chaos beyond the gates. The once disciplined camp now trembled under its own sins. One guard screamed orders in Japanese. Another shot a prisoner for disobedience. No one knew what was happening. Only that fear had turned inward, devouring the men who once ruled them. Mi-sun clutched Hannah's hand. "They're going to kill us before they leave." Hannah's eyes hardened. "Not if we move first." The night turned black, a storm swallowing the moon. Lightning revealed bodies piled against fences, evidence of panicked executions. Hannah crept through the shadows, every step a gamble. The mud sucked at her bare feet as if begging her to stay. Behind her, Mi-sun followed, trembling but determined. They reached the officers' quarters, a place forbidden to even glance at. Inside, Captain Sato was burning documents, his face pale under the lantern's flame. His hand shook as he poured whiskey, muttering, "No witnesses, no records." He didn't see Hannah slip in, didn't hear her breathing through clenched teeth. When his back turned, she lunged, not with a weapon, but with fury sharpened by years of torment. They struggled, her hands clawing at the symbol of his power, tearing the insignia from his chest. He struck her down, the bottle shattering across her face. But Mi-sun, small, silent Mi-sun, picked up a piece of broken glass. She drove it into his throat. A wet gasp. Blood sprayed the wall like ink on parchment. Sato fell, his eyes wide. Shocked, not by death, but by the thought that two of his slaves had fought back. For a long moment, the room was still except for the crackle of fire. Then Hannah stood, trembling but alive. She looked down at Sato's body, the monster finally silent. "This is for everyone you destroyed." They took his keys, unlocked the storage shed, and freed whoever could still walk. Some were too weak, others already gone, but those who remained followed Hannah, a procession of ghosts marching through the storm. When they reached the camp gate, it was half open, twisted by an earlier blast. Beyond it lay a field, dark, endless, but free. Hannah turned to Mi-sun. "No more whispers," she said. "Tonight, we run." They ran barefoot through mud and blood and lightning. Behind them, the camp burned, flames devouring the wooden walls, erasing the evidence of horror. For years, that place had consumed souls. Now it was consuming itself. As dawn approached, the smoke rose into a blood-red sky. Hannah looked back only once, not in fear, but in mourning. "Let it burn," she whispered. "Let it all burn." The sun broke through the clouds, not mercifully, but truthfully, revealing the faces of the survivors. Torn, scarred, yet unbroken, and in that moment, for the first time in years, they were not prisoners. They were witnesses. The morning after their escape, silence hung heavy. A silence so vast it felt unnatural. Hannah and Mi-sun limped across the charred landscape, their skin blistered from the cold wind and the memory of fire. Behind them, the smoke from the camp drifted skyward like a black confession, rising toward a God that had never listened. They reached the remnants of a village, once alive, now only bones of buildings and the scent of decay. Charred toys lay half-buried in ash, doorways gaped like open mouths, and birds refused to sing. "This was home," whispered Mi-sun, her voice breaking, before the soldiers came. The village well was filled with debris, a woman's shoe, a child's doll, a rusted helmet. Hana stared into the water's reflection and saw not herself, but the faces of those she could not save. The survivors from the camp, a few women, a boy no older than 12, and an old man missing an arm, spread out silently, searching for anything: food, shelter, forgiveness. But the earth gave them nothing. It had been bled dry by war. Mi-sun knelt beside a collapsed wall and found a half-burnt photograph. A family smiling in the sunlight. She held it close, her lips trembling. "They look happy." Hana said nothing. She couldn't, because happiness now felt like a lie, a word invented by people who had never seen death blink. When night fell, the survivors gathered around a small fire. No one spoke at first. The crackle of burning wood sounded like distant gunfire. Then the boy asked, "Are we safe now?" Mi-sun's eyes filled with tears. "Safe?" she repeated, as if testing the word. She looked to Hana for an answer. Hana stared into the flames, watching them twist like the ghosts of the camp. "Safety doesn't exist," she said quietly. "Only truth does. And truth is, we're still alive." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Hana reached into her torn dress and pulled out something wrapped in cloth, a piece of the camp's flag. She threw it into the fire. The flames turned green for a moment, hissing as if the symbol itself screamed. "Never again," Hana whispered. "Not to us, not to anyone." As the flag burned, the survivors felt something unspoken pass between them. Not hope, but defiance. Above them, the stars emerged. Faint, trembling, but real. And for the first time in years, the wind didn't smell of fear. Mi-sun leaned her head against Hana's shoulder. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Hana looked toward the horizon, where the ashes met the dawn. "They will," she said, "because we'll make them listen." The fire crackled, casting shadows across their faces. Faces marked by pain, yet illuminated by something stronger. The will to be remembered. By the time the Allied soldiers found them, Hana and Mi-sun looked less like survivors and more like shadows. Their clothes were torn, their feet raw, their eyes hollowed by exhaustion. When the jeeps appeared on the road, the women didn't cheer. They simply watched, uncertain if salvation was real or another cruel trick. An American medic jumped out first, his rifle slung across his back. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, seeing the group of half-starved women huddled together. He shouted for blankets, for food, for help. But Hana didn't move, not until the soldier knelt before her and said softly, "You're safe now. Safe." The word felt poisonous. As the soldiers loaded them into trucks, Mi-sun gripped Hana's hand. "We made it," she whispered. But Hana's gaze was fixed on the horizon, the rising sun bleeding through the fog. "We escaped the camp," she said. "Not the world." They were taken to a field hospital near Seoul. Nurses gasped when they saw the scars. Reporters came, their cameras flashing like gunfire. Questions poured in. Who were they? What happened? Who did this? But when Hana began to speak, when she uttered the words, "Comfort women," a silence fell across the tent. The officers exchanged glances. The interpreter hesitated. Then a quiet order came down from somewhere high above. "Do not record details. Do not publish names." The women were handed clothes, told they were heroes, then told to forget. The same mouths that promised freedom now demanded silence. Hannah tried to write her story. She filled pages with names: the dead, the missing, the girls who sang lullabies in the dark. But when she handed her notebook to an officer, it disappeared. Days later, when she asked about it, the officer sighed. "For your own peace," he said. "It's better this way." Mi-sun cried that night, not for what they'd suffered, but for how easily truth was buried. "They want to erase us again," she said. Hannah's reply was quiet, almost prayerful. "Then we'll haunt them." That evening, a storm rolled in. The wind tore through the camp, scattering papers, extinguishing lamps. Hannah stood in the doorway of the hospital tent, letting the rain wash her face. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, she saw reflections of the others. Hundreds of women standing behind her, silent, drenched, unbroken. They were not gone. They were memory made flesh, and memory could never be erased. Years later, when historians dug through forgotten files, they found fragments of Hannah's handwriting, a list of names. A single line written at the bottom: "If the world forgets us, may the earth remember." The soldiers called it a ghost story, but to those who'd lived through the fire, it was truth carved into time. Decades passed. The war ended. The flags changed. The world moved on, but silence remained. For years, no one spoke their names. No one dared. Hannah lived a quiet life in a small fishing village by the coast. Her hair turned silver, her hands rough from work. To the world, she was just another old woman. But every dawn, she would stand by the sea and whisper into the wind the names of the girls who never made it home. Mi-sun visited often, bringing her flowers or a small radio. The songs they once hummed in captivity had returned to the airwaves, cheerful, empty, as if history had healed itself. But Hannah knew the truth. Some wounds never close. They just learn to hide under the skin of peace. Then one spring, a young journalist came knocking. Her name was Ji-yeon. Barely 20, with eyes full of fire and questions, she had discovered fragments of a diary in the National Archives. The one Hannah thought lost forever. "Are you the woman who wrote this?" Ji-yeon asked, holding the fragile pages. Hannah hesitated. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "Yes," Ji-yeon's hands trembled. "The world needs to know what happened." For a long moment, Hannah said nothing. The waves crashed outside, echoing the same rhythm as distant drums. Then she nodded. "If you tell them, don't make it a story. Make it a warning." Days later, Hannah sat beneath a cherry blossom tree, watching petals fall like snow. Ji-yeon recorded her voice, trembling, quiet, yet fierce. Hannah told her everything: the camp, the pain, the night of fire, the run through the storm. Every detail she had buried now rose like ghosts demanding justice. When the recording was released, it spread faster than anyone expected. Newspapers published her name. Universities invited her to speak. For the first time, the world listened, but not everyone believed. Some called it propaganda. Some said she was lying. Others said that was the past. "Let it go." Hannah faced the cameras and said, "I did not survive so you could forget me." Her words became a spark, igniting protests, memorials, and truth commissions. Across Asia, statues of young girls appeared in city squares, bronze faces staring into eternity, unblinking, unafraid. Beneath them, a single inscription read, "We were not comfort. We were courage." The years wore on. Hannah passed quietly in her sleep, the sea murmuring outside her window. But the next morning, villagers swore they heard voices on the wind. Soft, defiant, countless, whispering names into the dawn. In Seoul, Ji-yeon stood before a crowd at the unveiling of a new monument. She placed Hannah's diary at its base and spoke into the microphone. "They tried to erase them. But history has a heartbeat, and today it's still beating. The cameras clicked, the crowd fell silent, and somewhere, beyond time and war, Hana and Misun walked together again, free at last, their shadows fading into the light. Fade to black. Whisper, remember us, and never again.